Lakeland Currents, your public affairs program for north central Minnesota. Production funding for Lakeland Currents is made possible by Bemidji Regional Airport, serving the region with daily flights to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. More information available at bemidjiairport.org. Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Online at nisswatax.com.
Hello, welcome to Lakeland Currents. I'm Carl Sewell. On this episode, we're talking about white-tailed deer. Each year, more than 500,000 deer hunters take to the woods in Minnesota, participating in a beloved tradition, while generating $500 million for the state's economy. On the other hand, thousands of motorists hit white-tailed deer every year in the state. They spread some diseases and devastate people's gardens. So how should we best manage the deer population? That's what we'll be discussing today with our two guests. Dave Rave is Bemidji Area Wildlife Manager for the DNR, and Jacob Haus is Wildlife Biologist at Bemidji State University. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks, Carl.
So to start off today, maybe Dave, you could start. What are the objectives for managing the deer herd here in Minnesota? How have they shifted over time, and what is it that you're shooting for?
Well, we've taken and done quite a bit of goal setting, where we have brought in people from the community, deer hunters, farmers, other people in agriculture, people with MnDOT. And we've gone from deer permit area to deer permit area and done these goal settings, and we try to set a goal that tries to bring in all these different goals of fewer car accidents, things like diseases that are carried not by the deer but by deer ticks, so health issues, and also making sure that there's enough deer to make our hunters happy.
Okay, and that varies a lot across.
So that varies across the state. You know, in the agricultural parts of the state, there's always going to be fewer deer and more agricultural issues, whereas in the forested parts of the state, there's probably going to be more deer and fewer agricultural issues.
All right. And do you have anything from a biologist perspective on how deer are managed or should be managed, or what are objectives there biologically?
Yeah, it's mostly to keep deer in check with the habitat as well. So from a forestry perspective, making sure they're not being destructive to regeneration of forestry lands and agriculture as well.
Yeah, you see, I know a lot of the plantings that you see are often topped with paper sometimes or other things to stop the browsing.
Yeah, those new growth is what's really...
They call that bud capping.
Okay.
And like Dr. Haus said, it's a piece of paper that keeps the new growth from being eaten by the deer.
All right. One of the issues around deer lately that has been much in the news and much concern, I think, from every management perspective, has been the disease issues. And I know the one that's gotten the most discussion lately has been chronic wasting disease. Could you talk a little bit and explain to us what that disease is and what the particular problems with it are?
Yeah, so chronic wasting disease is a degenerative neurological condition. It's CWD belongs into a family of diseases that has another three-letter acronym, TSEs, which are transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. So there's several different TSEs. There's human variants, most notably variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. There's bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, which is the mad cow disease. Correct, yeah. So if you recall, in the 90s, there was the big scare, primarily in the UK, when mad cow made the jump to humans and caused variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans. So that's one of the concerns with chronic wasting disease. The causative agent of all TSEs...
It hasn't made the jump to humans yet, is that correct?
It has not, as far as we can tell. There's been two studies, one in Alberta and one out west in the Rocky Mountain Research Lab. They used macaque monkeys, and they infected them with chronic wasting disease, or tried to get them to be infected with chronic wasting disease by eating infected venison, brain tissue. They injected it directly into their brains, the prion. And the study in the Rocky Mountain National Research Lab found that infection, if it was possible, it was very, very low probability. The study in Alberta found that there maybe was some evidence for transmissibility. So it was kind of conflicting results and
worrisome.
Worrisome, yeah.
And part of the reason why it's so worrisome, you said it's a prion-based disease.
Yes.
There's no, as I understand it, there's no vaccine that could even be developed?
Yeah,
it's not a bacterium or a virus, right?
So prions are basically what amounts to a misfolded protein. Now, the structure of the protein has changed, and then it is able to replicate itself and misfold other proteins. So it's not actually alive, so there's no real way to kill it, per se. So fire doesn't denature it. Bleach, vacuum, existing in a vacuum, none of these things kill or denature the protein.
Pretty worrisome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're able to persist on the landscape for an unknown amount of time, but a long time.
Yeah, and what's the prevalence of CWD in Minnesota, and what's the distribution? How big a problem is it now?
So it's spotty, right? So it first popped up in the southeastern portion of the state, and now it's found in Crow Wing County as well. So in those isolated areas, prevalence is what we would assume to be higher than in other areas of the state. But what are they sitting down in the southeast at? Under 5% prevalence.
Under 5%, but they have been found in wild deer in both of those two areas, the southeast and in the Crow Wing County. And so that's not good news.
No. In my reading on the issue, some of the management concerns were from domestic or privately held deer herds.
Yeah.
How big of an issue is that in the state? How many deer farms are there, or how many people are keeping deer in cages? Do we know?
The Department of Health actually, and the
Board of Animal Health.
Board of Animal Health actually keeps track of that, and we don't know. I don't know the total number, but it's a substantial number of them, in the hundreds, and they're spread across the state. And animals do escape from these facilities, and if they have CWD, then of course that then takes it out into the wild. So.
And I would assume that's more of a concern, those kinds of facilities, because of the density of the deer, that it might spread. Do we know how the disease spreads? Is it?
We know a little bit. We're still learning a lot. But the best mode of transmission is from nose-to-nose contact or through saliva. They can also shed the prions in feces, urine. If a deer dies and decomposes in an area, the prions from the central nervous system will be there on the landscape. Plants can actually uptake the prions, so then if a deer comes along, eats from either the soil of where an infected deer has died or has shed feces, or from the plant itself that has uptaken the prion, then they could potentially become susceptible as well.
Wow, that's new information to me, that it goes into plants. So what's the DNR doing? Are there some new regulations that people should be aware of as they're out deer hunting around CWD?
There are quite a few regulations. In the two different, in the CWD zones, we are taking samples from the deer. And so that's down in the Brainerd area and over in the Glenwood area and down in the southeast part of the state. So all deer in the areas that have been found where the CWD has been found, either in the wild or in a captive facility, we're sampling all deer in those areas. In the areas where they've actually found them in the wild, in those areas you can't take your deer out of those areas until after the sample has been taken and the sample has been proved either positive or negative. And if it's proved negative, then you can remove the deer from those areas.
You mean transport it?
Transport it, yes. Transport the head and the nervous system. You can quarter the deer and take the meat, but you can't take the head or the nervous system.
What would somebody do if they did that? Would they have to dispose of the head and nervous system, leave it in the woods?
No,
I assume it's not the right thing to do.
We will have disposal areas where they can put the head and the spinal cord.
Okay. What about other diseases? You mentioned tick-borne illnesses being a concern, and the most famous of those is Lyme's disease, of course, spread by the deer tick. Are deer a vector for that? Is there some management concerns?
Yeah, so deer don't actually get Lyme's disease, which is part of the problem. So they can act as a host of the disease and then increase tick abundance and move the ticks around the landscape. And then as the ticks fall off and fall off into your backyard and end up on you, that's part of the concern there.
Yeah, and is there anything from a management perspective that we can do? I mean, I would love it if we could reduce deer ticks. That would be a boon to all of us. But
unfortunately, at this point, I'm not sure we know of any way to reduce deer ticks. Deer ticks are not only on deer, but they're also on many of the small mammals that are in everybody's backyard. Mice are a large carrier of deer ticks, and the deer ticks are on mice. Pretty much everybody has mice in their yard. So it's going to be very difficult to reduce it now that it's here.
Are deer ticks invasive? I seem to remember when I was growing up, we never had deer ticks, or I didn't know about them. Maybe wood ticks were everywhere, but deer ticks it seems like they're growing. Are they?
It's not necessarily that they're invasive, but they are expanding their range northward.
Okay. Yeah. Is that a climate?
And westward. They originally came mostly from the East Coast, and they're moving this way. And it has to do with a lot of different things, but climate change is one thing that it's changing, but just people moving dogs and other things around has sped up the movement of them. So, people hunt on the East Coast, and then they bring their hunting dogs to Minnesota to hunt, and that has brought some. And then deer populations, the high deer populations, deer move things like deer ticks much faster than, say, mice, which have a very small home range. The deer can move over 4 or 5 miles, and so they tend to carry the ticks further, and the ticks fall off further away, and so they can move the deer. All right. As the deer population across the country has increased, which it has really increased over the last 40 years, 50 years, it's helped to move those ticks around.
Okay. One of the issues with deer management that I think is interesting and changing a lot year by year is how deer management and deer populations are affected by the management of other species. And I'm thinking probably the one that gets most people most fired up is wolf management. First of all, what's the status of wolves right now in terms of their protected status?
Wolves are federally protected right now. So if you'll recall, there was a hunting and trapping season in Minnesota. What year was that? 2000?
Yeah, that was about 3 or 4 years ago. I can't remember what.
There was just one season?
I think there was 3 seasons.
Okay.
3 years when we actually had a trapping and hunting season. And then
there was a lawsuit that
ended
up with the wolves being federally relisted on the endangered species list. And so now they're under federal protection. So the state doesn't manage wolves at all.
So there's a wolf reintroduction or a wolf management plan for the eastern half of the United States. And Minnesota had met their goal of wolves. So we have more than enough wolves in Minnesota to meet Minnesota's goal. However, there's other states to our east that have not met that goal and don't have as many wolves as Minnesota and haven't met the goal that they have in the eastern wolf population plan. And so the lawsuit said that until all of those states meet their goals, Minnesota can't have a hunting season.
When we did have that hunting season and trapping season for those few years, do you know how that affected the wolf population, and then downstream how that may have affected the deer population?
There's about 400 wolves taken.
There was 400. I believe that was our goal every year, and I believe we hit our goal every year, about 400. And it stabilized the wolf population. I don't think that it decreased the wolf population a lot. 400 wolves just isn't that many in a population of 3,500.
They also have a very high reproductive rate, so they're able to recover from slight declines in their population very quickly.
So I doubt that it made a huge dent, but there's other things that having a not totally protected population does for you. For example, if a landowner has a cow that's being attacked and killed by wolves, at this point he can't legally shoot that animal. Whereas when we had more say in the state, we would have allowed him to shoot that animal, and so it wasn't completely protected. And so that makes people pretty upset when their animals are being killed by a protected animal and they can't do much about it. Now there is the USDA does have trappers that will come out and trap, and so they do have some help when their animals are being attacked, but it's not as good of protection as if we had more say on it.
But what about the deer population? Because I know a lot of people personally who have wolves on their land and would like to get rid of them in order to increase their chances of taking a deer. That's an issue that gets people very emotional as well. But what is the link between having wolves and having deer on your land?
Well, it's twofold. So wolves obviously eat deer. They eat about 6 pounds of deer a day. A wolf will. But then they also put a pressure on deer from a fear perspective. So deer, their response is to be pushed more and more nocturnal and avoid areas where there are wolves. So if there's wolves on your property, the deer either aren't going to be there, or they may only be there during after dark. So.
Yeah, so there is a real link, and people are rightfully, because I've heard other people say, no, wolves and deer, they get along. Right?
Yeah, no.
Well, obviously they prey on them.
Right, obviously deer and wolves don't get along in the fact that, they're not friends, but the wolves eat deer. There's no question about it. That's what they're built for. That's what they've evolved to eat deer, and they do a good job of it. However, there's the population of deer up, especially in the northern part of the state, is probably much more controlled by weather than it is by wolves. The wolves do eat deer, and the wolves move deer around. Like we were alluding to earlier, the deer or wolves that are on your property can keep deer from being on your property if the wolves are around. But wolves have a very large home range, and so they're not going to be in areas that don't have deer for very long. And so once the deer have moved off your property, the deer or the wolves are going to move along too. So I would say that, yeah, it's very possible that if there's wolves that are using your property at the time, right when the hunting season starts, that it may keep the deer off for a time. But overall, I don't know that, the deer are being knocked down by wolf populations.
Another species that's related to deer management is the moose, and I know over the last few decades the moose population in Minnesota has been declining pretty dramatically. The last I heard, I think it has been stable for a few years now. Is that correct?
The decline in the northeast population seems to have stabilized over the last few years. Yeah.
And how are deer being managed, and what are the effects of white-tailed deer on moose, and how are we prioritizing the management of these two species?
So I believe in the moose zone, the goal is to manage for 10 deer per square mile.
And how does that relate to other zones?
It'd be much lower. Yeah.
Okay.
So part of the concern is deer are both a competitor for moose, but then they also transmit a disease called brainworm or P. tenuis, which is a disease of deer that does not impact deer. They carry the brainworm. But then they shed it onto the landscape, and then it does impact the moose. So it can be fatal to moose.
We had a moose a couple of years ago swimming in Lake Bemidji here that people might have been familiar with. Was that moose suffering from the brainworm? Is that why it moved out of its range?
No, that one probably was just a young bull. I actually worked that particular moose and helped to keep people back away from it, to keep them safe. It was really an exciting thing for people to see the moose. I had a couple of people tell me it was the most exciting thing that's ever happened in Bemidji. So, and it was exciting.
The bear that was on campus a couple of years ago.
The moose was beautiful. It was one of the biggest bulls I've seen, really big-bodied. It didn't have a huge rack, but it had a nice rack. But that animal was probably a mid-range male, and it was the breeding season, and it was just wandering around looking for cows.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. So the moose area in the northeast being managed for deer much lower. I know urban populations of deer. I live right in the middle of town in Bemidji here, and I have deer in my yard every night, and I'm a mile from any patch of forest. They eat everything. They get hit by cars. I looked up some of the stats from the Department of Transportation, and I think last year there was something like 1,500 collisions recorded by the state and hundreds of injuries related to that. These are obviously closer to more heavily populated areas where white-tailed deer seem to do incredibly well for some reason. How are we managing urban populations of deer, and what can cities do?
Well, here in Minnesota, or in Bemidji, we actually have a city deer hunt, which is a archery hunt. And so they have a certain number of areas that are set up with blinds in them. And they have people that apply every year for the archery hunt. And all those people have to go down and qualify and make sure that the police department looks at the applicants to make sure that there's no felons or any other kinds of problems that might arise. And they have them take a proficiency test, so they fire their bow and have to hit a target so that they're not out injuring a bunch of deer. And in that way, we're harvesting animals in the city limits and trying to keep the population down.
That's been going for a few years now. Has it been effective?
It's been going for quite a few years.
So every fall for the last, I think we're in year 7 or year 8, Bemidji State University has been conducting spotlight surveys in 3 different wards within city limits. It looks like numbers have been relatively stable, maybe slightly increasing, but it's hard to measure the effectiveness of the archery hunt because it's hard to say what would densities be like without the hunt, right?
Yeah, there's no control.
Yeah.
There's something to compare it to.
Right, yeah.
How many deer have been taken from the city? Do you know?
There's usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 deer a year between the 3 hunts that are harvested. So, if you think about that over 10 years or so, that's getting up there in the 300 deer. So that's a pretty good number. Plus the deer then get taken home and used by people. The meat gets used versus if they weren't being killed that way, they'd probably be being injured by cars and being killed by cars, and those deer end up in the garbage can. So that's it's a way that we can get the deer used, provide some recreation for people, and do hopefully good things for the city deer population.
Okay, so as we're recording this, we're in the fall right now, in the middle of hunting season. Could you talk a little bit about what the deer behavior is at? What are the stages of deer seasonal biology that people are experiencing right now? There's a lot more of the deer are running around, probably for a lot of reasons. Yep. One of which there's 500,000 people in the woods, or 500 million maybe, no, 500,000. But what else are the deer behavior changes this time of year? And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, we're coming right up to the peak of their mating season, which runs somewhere between November 12th and November 15th. So that's driven by the amount of daylight in a single day, or what's called the photo period. So that triggers a rise in testosterone in the males, so you'll see them start running around. You might see them crossing roads a little more. They're acting a little more reckless and chasing the females around, which are just about to come into what we call estrus, or their first breeding cycle.
Okay.
So that actually has a lot to do with whether hunters are successful or not. For example, last year we opened the season on the 4th of November. And so it was pretty warm, and the deer weren't quite into their rut at that time, or the breeding season. And so the very first weekend of the season, it was pretty warm. The deer weren't chasing each other. The deer didn't move very much, and so very few people, fewer people shot bucks than would normally shoot bucks. This year, the deer are chasing each other. The bucks are running around day and night because they want to breed. They're out there. So the timing of the season can be make a big difference as to the number of deer that people see. And so I think that a lot of people saw bucks this year on opening weekend. I think that the wind and the cold this weekend didn't help with deer movement, but being in the peak of the rut really did. And as we discussed, the bucks begin chasing the does, and that's pretty much come to a peak, and it came to a peak probably in the middle of last week. And the does were running away because they weren't quite at the right stage. Now the does are letting the bucks catch them, and so now there won't be quite as much of that movement. You'll see a doe walking, and the buck will be walking right behind her. So for last weekend, mostly what you saw was does running away and the bucks running after them. From now until the end of the season, probably you'll be more likely to see a doe walking with the buck walking behind her.
And that has a significant effect on people's success rates
Yep.
in hunting?
Yep. The bucks are pretty stupid during the rut. They do things that normally during most of the year they're pretty nocturnal, and they become more of a 24-hour a day go.
Okay, my last question, or as we begin to wrap things up here, can you give me a big picture about deer management in the state? What's the overall, first of all, the goals for management? How have they changed in recent years? What's the overall health of the deer herd in Minnesota?
Well, overall, the herd is very healthy. The state of Minnesota just released its, was it 2018?
It was 2018.
Their first ever 10-year deer management plan, which generally outlined the goal setting process and made that a little more transparent, but then also a goal of 200,000?
200,000 as the harvest. We'd like to harvest 200,000 deer every year. And the way that they get at that is we had those goal setting meetings, and there's a number of deer permit areas throughout the state, and each deer permit area is set to a certain number of deer, depending on, again, whether there's problems with agriculture or what the hunters feel like, the number of deer car accidents in the area. So once you take that into effect into the number, and they look at the number of hunters in each one, they figure what a good percentage rate of hunters harvesting a deer, and 200,000 was overall through all the deer permit areas. That was what they've come up with as a overall goal for the state.
And that's right around where the figure had been previously, if I'm not mistaken.
It's very close, yep.
I think last year was a little bit under.
Last year we were a little under, yep.
Okay.
But that was somewhat by design too. The harvest had been set in each deer permit area, had been set a little conservative for several years, and now we're kind of pulling the reins back a little bit and are letting some of these permit areas loose a little bit.
And are there other management tools other than hunting that the DNR has access to? Is there basically just how many permits you offer?
Pretty much the number of permits we offer, and it's mostly, the way that we manage our deer herd, we allow everybody to take a buck pretty much every year, and what changes is the number of doe permits or the antlerless permits. And to control a deer population, every one of the does is likely to be bred every year because there's enough bucks out there to breed the does. So the way that you bring the population down is to take does out of the population. And as I mentioned earlier, winter is really one of our biggest.
Snow depth.
Snow depth. There's two different things that factor into it: snow depth and temperature. And so we have what they call a deer severity index. And so the deer severity index is the number of days where snow depth is over 15 inches and the number of days where the temperature drops below 0 for the day.
They get a point for each one of those categories, and then the sum of those points over the winter is what contributes to the winter.
It's shaping up to be a pretty severe one so far this year.
So
well, all right, well, we're gonna have to wrap it up and leave it there. But it's been a good discussion. Thank you both for joining me, and thank you for joining me on Lakeland Currents.